This little sculpture is the embodiment of femininity. Her face is not important because she's not a portrait. Rather, her appeal is on obvious display in her full breasts, belly, and hips, which more than suggest womanhood and reproductive vitality, traits common to other carvings of this time. So it is not unreasonable to imagine everything she embodies must have been important to the people of this era. There are several examples of carved nude female figures from this time period, but this one has the distinction of being one of the oldest relief sculptures yet discovered. She is also quite large compared to other figures of the era at around 1.5 feet tall. She started life somewhere around 25,000 to 20,000 BCE as part of a giant rock carving that stood right out front of a stone dwelling. She is completely nude except for traces of red ochre on her limestone flesh. She's not a realistic representation of the human female form. She is full of exaggerations of femininity, even though her anatomy is very clearly represented and all of her bits are where they should be on a female body. But she is exaggerated because she is a representation of a mature, fertile form, carefully carved in a frontal perspective by craftsmen. Her left arm and hand rest on her belly, while her right arm holds aloft a bison horn with 13 notches carved in it. Why 13? There are 13 lunar cycles, so perhaps there was some awareness of the link between reproduction and the moon, especially where human fertility is concerned. It is unknown if she was a blessing or a totem for the people living inside the shelter where she stood, and it's possible she's also a charm for a bountiful life, a fetish to help secure the future of the inhabitants through progeny. This panel bears the pride and accomplishments of Ashurnasirpal II in the standard inscription stamped in cuneiform across its middle. It was one of many reliefs that adorned the walls of the extravagant northern palace he built. The inscription was believed to be magical, and it supports the divine protection of the king and the palace. The cuneiform is carved across the images of kings and gods alike. It was important to unite the words and images, bonding them together for eternity. The king began the tradition of covering the palace walls with reliefs like this, many of which were added by his successors over the next 2 centuries to celebrate their accomplishments. This enormous slab of gypsum alabaster is actually 1/2 of a larger piece, the 2 panels each measuring over 7.5 feet across, and it was meant to be grand to present the glorious deeds and exploits of the king. Ashurnasirpal II appears bearded, his noble head bearing his crown, the exquisite details of his embroidered garments lost to time. There is no mistaking his regal and powerful presence as he is accompanied by his attendants. His Majesty is also blessed by the presence of an Apkallu, a mystical sage whose purpose was to bring the arts of civilization to the area. All of the figures are represented in a somewhat twisted perspective, with the slightly stylized frontal depicted eyes looking back at the viewer with all the lower bodies in profile. However, the king, one of his attendants, and the Apkallu have touches of foreshortening. The angle of their shoulders is not depicted as strictly frontal, nor is it profile. It feels like a combination of the 2 views to try and display torsion in the bodies, but it does fall short of being a full 3/4 view. Perhaps the figures were an experiment in figure study. All who entered the palace laid eyes on panels like this, but not every guest may have had access to these specific panels, as they were discovered in a chamber that seemed to house sarcophagi. But there's no way to know if that was always that room's purpose. This is not art. At least it was not created as such compared to the way it is viewed today. It was not meant to hang on a wall in a home for visitors to look at and admire. It was meant to be entombed with the dead to assist them in their journey to the afterlife. This particular piece was tailored specifically for Hu Nefer, royal scribe and scribe of divine offerings, also known as overseer of royal cattle and steward of King Seti I. There is specific text to address the life he lived once he passes over on his way to the afterlife. This reads like a manual of exactly what he must say to Osiris and how to behave in front of all who oversee his judgment. This tells the story of what he would expect, and it is full of incantations and spells to help him pass that judgment on the scales of Mat and avoid having his heart eaten by Ammit. The story told is straightforward. Nearly all of the forms in the lower part of the scroll are rendered in twisted perspective, showing the form and its features from the most recognizable angle, meaning every part is depicted in profile. However, the eye and shoulders are in a frontal perspective. This was a very common practice, and one only needs to look at other 2-dimensional examples of Egyptian art to see the style was practiced over the course of many hundreds of years. So while you may revere this piece as beautiful art today, remember it is so much more than that. This fresco was painted on a wall of a home of a well-off patron in Akrotiri on Thera, part of the islands called the Cyclades. Painted during the 16th century BCE, There was a volcanic event that occurred between 1650 and 1550 BCE, which destroyed the city but preserved the artwork beautifully. This particular piece is a fresco and it stands just under 4 feet 10 inches tall. The wall it was painted on was created in layers, starting with straw, then a rough layer of plaster over which another finer layer of plaster was laid. From there, the artist used mineral-based paints to get these bright dynamic colors. The lifestyle here on Thera, during the Aegean Bronze Age, circa 3000 to 1000 BCE, was one of village life, and the painting reflects what was important to them: nature, valued rituals, and their relationship with the sea. This boy was painted as all males were painted at the time, nude with dark pigments in the twisted perspective that Aegean artists favored. The artist tried to express the hairstyle of the boy's shaved head with a lighter shade than the locks of longer hair, which are painted dark. And overall, this fresco is very stylized, with long, graceful, organic lines forming the human body. He is holding an almost obscene amount of fish, which emphasizes how abundant the sea was. This painting was created in a room that was primarily used for offerings, and it has a duality as a commentary on the people's relationship with the sea, as well as reminding them when they are making offerings to their gods in the offering room that it is necessary to thank them for such plentiful blessings. Utha Metis painted this red figure amphora, which was of the type used to transport and store consumables like olive oil, honey, and wine. Created around 510 BCE, it stands about 2 feet tall. He was never celebrated as an artist in his day as much as he was a laborer. This amphora was found in a tomb in Italy where it had been preserved for centuries. Utha Metis was a great artist in his day, surrounded by other great artists in Kerameikos, otherwise known as the Potter's Quarter in Old Athens, and they had quite some rivalries among themselves. The red figure technique was in its infancy when he started experimenting with it and challenging the figure drawing technique of the day. Using the red clay for skin tone represented true Athenians with their darker skin. Using a fresh pot, and instead of painting the people with the black glaze, Utha Metis outlined them and painted the background black. He found he could also dilute the glaze to create other shades of brown, which allowed more color diversity for painting details, and he could control how thickly the glaze was where he wanted more or less texture. The scene of the 3 revelers is famous, but many people don't realize that this is just one side of this amphora. The other side is covered with his interpretation of Hector receiving his helmet from his mother before going off to the Trojan War. It was common to incorporate mythological stories into artwork, along with regular everyday activities. And the work here is an almost quintessential example of why Utha Metis and other red clay artists were called the pioneer group. But Utha Metis took it farther, and he refused to be outdone by his rival Euphronios. They challenged and pushed each other, and Utha Metis experimented with foreshortening, a 3/4 view of the human form. It just wasn't done at the time. He used the other side of arming of Hector to play with figure studies. Note that the drawings do not overlap, as they are independent studies of 3 separate people, and the 2 on the flanks are truly eclipsed by the center study of a drunken man in 3/4 view. He was a rebel and impressed with his own attempts here to the point of bragging to rile up his rival, Euphronios. He signed it along with the famous taunt, "As never Euphronios could do, Utha Metis painted me." The frescoes were painted on the walls of this bedroom in Bosco Reale on the slopes of Vesuvius at the villa of P. Fannius Sinistor between 50 and 40 BCE during the late Republic period of Rome. It wasn't practical to use the expensive marble for the walls, so artists began painting faux marble designs as a more reasonable alternative. Years later, these frescoes were added in what is called the second style, using linear perspective to create the illusion of dimensional space beyond the confines of the room. Ancient Romans loved the Greek Hellenistic period, and the Greeks inspired in them the ideals of their culture, art, and philosophies, which are brought as much to life as possible in these frescoes. Looking at a different angle of the side wall, the recess the artist painted looks like the wall actually extrudes back. The crown molding at the top where the columns begin looks like actual trim. Looking to the back wall, the columns also look like they're substantive and dimensional. Including in the scene is an image of the goddess Hecate below the fountain. She was worshipped in the home by Greeks and Romans alike, but household worship hoped to keep evil spirits away from the home, so it made sense to include her in the fresco in this bedroom. Taking the time to look at this room from many angles, there is much to see in this room full of illusion. This mosaic was created using small pieces of cut glass called tesserae around 425 CE, when Christianity was still in its infancy after being legitimized by Emperor Constantine. The Roman Empire had broken apart, rejoined, and split again into western and eastern parts, with now independently evolving traditions in each. Greco-Roman culture influenced early Christian art as images held great value to them, and as new converts they wanted to maintain those old customs as new Christians. These mosaics were not meant to have the delicacy and nuance of shading and value like one would see in naturalistic paintings. This artist clearly still valued the school of classical naturalism. Everything casts a shadow as much as possible. The artist clearly took great pains in the design composition, making use of the foreground all the way to the background. There's symmetry in the placement of the sheep as well as the rocks in the back, but the focus is on Christ, symbolized here as a shepherd caring for his flock. Everything is calm and serene, even though some figures, including Christ, are sitting near the cliff edge. Christ twists and places his hand on one sheep's head as if reassuring it, creating this lovely organic line joining shepherd to sheep. This is but one of many mosaics covering the interior of the Mausoleum of Galla Placidia in Ravenna. Middle Byzantine art came in the 9th century CE after iconoclasm saw much of the existing religious artwork destroyed or neglected. At that time, there was a dedicated effort to restore religious works. In the town of Gornji Nierezi in the Republic of Macedonia can be found the St. Pantaleimon monastery filled with brightly colored religious frescoes. This one is called Lamentation of Christ. Here we see Mary embracing her dead son, while Joseph of Arimathea, the disciple Nicodemus, and St. John are in attendance. Their faces are painted with grief. Even the angels are weeping. This was a trend of the Byzantine artists to manipulate the viewer's response, as Mary and John would not have been present according to the Christian Gospels. Those faces have touches of naturalism in them, and the artist attempted to create depth in the tableau, although it is still a largely two-dimensional scene. There are touches of a Renaissance nature centuries before its time, especially in the artist's attempts to paint more naturalistic faces and figures. The Book of Kells dates to around 800 CE and is made up of the 4 Gospels written in Latin on vellum. It contains 340 panels called folios. This panel is known as Plate 4, the Evangelists. It depicts the 4 evangelists, Matthew as the winged man, Mark, the winged lion, Luke, the winged ox, and John, the eagle. They are presented in the highly stylized execution common to the Anglo-Saxon style, which is noteworthy for its animal patterns and repeating serpentine knots. The artwork has pagan roots in the belief that nature was very important and different animals were probably believed to have properties and characteristics that would be conveyed on the objects on which they were created. As Christianity spread to Britain and the surrounding isles, many monasteries were built in what is now Ireland and Scotland, and the art that was created in these monasteries has been named Hiberno-Saxon art. The book had a home in Kells and did not come to Dublin until around 1653, and it has been on display at Trinity College, Dublin since the mid-1800s. It was not uncommon for beautifully and artfully embellished religious books like this to be used to spread the gospel to the inhabitants of the British Isles, but many believe the Book of Kells was primarily used for special religious occasions rather than for everyday use, due to the fact that there are many examples in the text where letters and words were omitted by the scribes, and in other cases, the text covered over by artwork. Not all art of the Middle Ages was religious. Titled people also commissioned arts, and an example of this is the Bayeux Tapestry, which chronicles the Norman invasion up to the Battle of Hastings, which saw William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, defeat Harold, Earl of Wessex, to claim the English throne. It measures around 20 inches high and 230 feet long, but the last several scenes have been lost to time, so it is incomplete today. It is unknown who made the tapestry, which is actually wool threads sewn to linen, but the commission of it has been attributed to Bishop Odo, and there have been arguments that attribute the embroidery to Matilda, wife of William, and even to Edith of Wessex, Harold's sister. The storytelling aspect is fascinating, and it is very clear what is happening from scene to scene. There are animals embroidered into the borders that have the stylized line work of Celtic Hiberno-Saxon artwork, and that type of imagery and symbolism is prevalent here, in fierce lions, eagles, and other animals, including mythological ones. The artist worked mostly in profile, but there are times when he or she tried to show a different perspective. For example, in one of the cavalry scenes, two men are shown with their feet facing forward in their stirrups, but their upper bodies appear backwards. The artist was surely trying to depict the confusion on the battlefield, showing these soldiers twisted all the way around in their saddles to look behind themselves at their surroundings. Battle scenes are rendered in awkward profile to show horses and men lying wounded and dead. This is dynamic, however, in that there is no confusion that the horses are being shown in different states of defeat, carrying their riders to the ground where the dead already lie. It is a very graphic, if not stylized, picture of war, and it is effective in telling the tale of the Norman conquest and the Saxons' defeat. The Chartres Cathedral has examples of early Gothic architecture that predates the High Gothic architecture that was added after a fire in 1194. One example of early Gothic art can be found in the western rose window. Storytelling was a way to educate people, and one of those ways of storytelling was in stained glass. But the story in glass was more a means to an end in achieving Abbot Suger's lux nova, which means new light. The transformation of sunlight into the church through the stained glass would give the interior space a mystical light quality meant to transcend the worshipper closer to heaven and the divine. The west rose window tells the story of the Last Judgment. The window is darker both physically and figuratively, made with plate tracery, where the stained glass is placed in the openings carved into the masonry. Compared to other rose windows, there is more masonry than glass, so the dark negative space between the plates is accentuated. Christ is in the center, surrounded by the four evangelists and angels, and outward depictions of the rapture, including the dead arisen and awaiting judgment. The fates of the unworthy are shown in 3 panels near the bottom, illustrating hell, with the worthy being escorted to heaven. Michael is seen weighing souls in between these 2 endings. Looking closely at the stained glass of the west rose window, the detail is incredible. Jesus' facial features are clear, and the folds in the cloth of everyone's garments show amazing craftsmanship. All of this adds to the overall beauty of the window, especially in this modern world where anybody who wants to can get a close-up look at everything that went into this amazing painting. This nearly 1 foot 10 inch by 2 foot 6 inch oil painting on canvas was created around 1470 by Paolo Gello, an artist operating in Florence during the early Italian Renaissance and a favorite of the Medici family. In this painting, St. George is in full armor atop a horse, slaying with his lance a plague-bearing dragon that is being reined in by a princess. Uccello had a unique style that was a mix of late Gothic influences that also tried to reconcile the growing trend of perspective and depth of other artists at the time. It showcases his penchant for patterns and decorative embellishments, such as in the wings of the dragon and the bridle of the horse, as well as the very stylized undulating clouds and the fussy grass patterns in the middle ground and foreground. He struggles with linear perspective. The textured lines in the pale dirt and grass in the foreground seem to be acting like orthogonal lines, but they don't quite line up right, especially the grasses in the closest foreground, and the ground texture lines don't follow at all once they get to the area of the dragon and beyond. St. George and his horse are rendered in a very nice 3/4 view, but again they are lacking many naturalistic elements. The figures are both still very stylized, like many similar figures in Gothic art. The proportions are just a bit off, but the lines and forms do flow together beautifully. Horse and rider almost seem as one. The princess or maiden is interesting as she appears calm, serene even, and shows no fear. She even seems to be reaching out to the dragon with one hand, her lips parted as if she is speaking to it as well, and her eyes and chin are downcast. She looks like a Gothic figure, elongated and graceful. As the painting reaches into the background, Uccello has done a better job of creating some depth, although the mountains are a bit too clearly drawn and not cool-toned enough to create a convincing view to the horizon, but it does a good job of expressing depth of field. The Arnolfini portrait by Jan van Eyck has long been considered an excellent example of Northern Renaissance art due to its perfection of oil paint and almost impossible representation of minute detail. It is a little over 2 feet 8 inches by nearly 2 feet, and it shows the merchant Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife standing in a very nicely decorated room. Arnolfini did not get his money from aristocratic inheritance, but rather from being a merchant, so he would have been considered middle class. Many debates have occurred between experts about whether this picture depicts a wedding, but according to the National Gallery, it is simply a double portrait. Still, others suggest it is quite possibly a memorial portrait of Arnolfini's wife, who would have been deceased by the time this painting was done. The couple stand in their lovely bedroom, dressed in very fine clothing, and every detail is carefully captured from the folds of the fabrics in their clothing and upholstery to the painted glass rounds encircling the mirror on the back wall. The dog in the foreground is painted with amazing detail on its coat, tempting the viewer to reach out and touch it. Its little face feels very alive looking out from the canvas, light glinting off its eyes and wet nose. The quality of light is very realistic as the stained glass window behind Arnolfini appears to glow. The chandelier bears very real highlights and shadows, and the glass beads hanging by the mirror on the back wall show light reflecting off the beads as well as refracting through them to put authentic highlights on the wall along with the beads' cast shadows. This effect was achieved by Van Eyck, painting multiple layers of thinned oil paint, and it's also how he achieved such deeply pigmented colors. Beyond the realistic light and details, this is also a painting full of symbolism, interpreted by understanding their meanings. For example, dogs in couples' portraits were common as they symbolized fidelity, and the single burning candle in the chandelier could represent the presence of God. Looking more closely at the chandelier, there is a burned-down candle across from the one that is lit. Might it represent Arnolfini still alive at the time of the painting, and the depleted candle, could it represent his dead wife as her life? Her candle has burned out? Portraits like this were not uncommon as the merchant class of the time patronized the arts and fostered an appetite for art that was intended for exhibit in the home. Albrecht Durer was an artist working in Nuremberg during the late 15th and early 16th centuries who was gifted in drawing, painting, and printing techniques. This piece, known as Night, Death, and the Devil, is an example of his engraving prowess. Well under the size of a standard leaf of notebook paper, the plate was printed on a nearly 10-inch by 8-inch sheet. It is a compact space for all of the detail, especially when considering that it was executed using a burris, a very sharp tool with a V-shaped tip used by pushing it through the metal as if drawing on the surface. This is what allowed such delicate lines and the fine detail. The print, which does a wonderful job showing depth of field, shows a mounted knight riding on a narrow, isolated path, accompanied by Death on his own horse, and the devil at the knight's right flank. Death is shown crowned and draped with serpents on the back of his horse, which is plodding along with his head held low, as if fatigued from a long journey. Death is twisted back into the side, his skull-like face cast upward at the knight to whom he appears to be speaking, while holding an hourglass topped with a timepiece, brandishing it in his fully fleshed hand as if mocking the knight with his own mortality. Close behind and to the side lurks the devil. He is pictured as a strange cross between a ram with a long snout like a wolf that ends with a pig's nose. He is reaching toward the knight's back with his clawed fingers as if to snag him stealthily from behind and tear him from his horse. Meanwhile, the knight sits upright in his saddle and his face looks to have a confident grin. He looks straight ahead, paying neither the devil nor Death attention. Durer's skill with anatomy and proportion is quite good, and he's captured the lines and musculature of the horses as well as the knight. Death is the same. His facial features are quite accurate to placement and proportion, and his movements from his hand holding the hourglass aloft to his cocked head are all very human, even as he is a mystical creature. This engraving may have been an actual illustration in the 15th century book Handbook of a Christian Knight by Erasmus, but others believe it is strictly inspired by the book, which urged Christians to act as soldiers, combating temptation and malevolence with faith. Titian was a contemporary and friend of Giorgione, and he finished some of Giorgione's incomplete paintings, including a pastoral landscape featuring a sleeping Venus. That canvas was the inspiration for Venus of Urbino. Famous for his portraits, he also gained some notoriety and attention among intellectually ambitious aristocrats for painting various lewd subjects. In this nearly 4 foot by 5 foot 5 inch painting, she lies back, unconcerned with her own nudity. While not overtly sexual in nature, it is a sensual picture. Perhaps since she's not alone in her rooms, it prevents this from appearing too racy for the time. A nude woman alone looking out from the canvas with such a coquettish expression might have had more the appearance of sex rather than beauty and sensuality. It should be noted that this woman was given the name Venus at a later date, possibly because she might have been appearing a bit too sexy, and to call her a Venus may have been a way to insulate her and maintain her presence as art rather than pornography. There is a softness to the entire painting, with gentle light and shadows, and the mood is heightened by the sunset out the back columned window. The tiles in the floor act as orthogonal lines and underscore Titian's understanding and use of perspective. The rumpled sheet she reclines on and the puffy pillows atop a prettily patterned cushion are very relaxed and inviting. Even the sumptuous folds of the dark green drapery behind her give this scene a lazy luxury. The softness and luminescent quality of this painting, right down to her glowing, specifically colored Titian locks, were achieved through a painstaking process of glazing, which is accomplished by layering thinned-out oil paints. It is understood that Titian easily put down 10 to 15 layers of paint to achieve the softness, borrowed from the Northern Renaissance artists, quickly became the standard of Italian Renaissance painters in the late period. After the Protestant Reformation, the north and south of Europe saw divergent artistic practices. The Catholic Church left behind austerity and endeavored to secure Rome as a holy city by commissioning massive building and decoration overhauls. In the north, however, the artists' market was now a very different place, especially in the newfound independence of the Dutch Republic. Without royalty and titled aristocrats and a predominantly Protestant population, the artists lost two previously lucrative patrons. The growing wealth of the bourgeois class found people looking to assert their status by buying art, which was meant entirely for home exhibition. This change in lifestyle and culture, both religiously and politically, saw an entirely new niche of art created called genre painting, and it covered subjects like landscapes, still life, and everyday life moments. Jan Steen was a painter who captured these everyday moments, like snapshots, of people's lives, and his brothel scenes were prolific. He painted over 40 of them. He operated an inn at his home and earned the reputation of being an unapologetic drunk, but that rumor seems to have been fostered by his penchant for painting himself into some of his scandalous scenes. In fact, Steen was a lifelong Catholic who moralized through his paintings, and not without a sense of humor. This 16-inch by 14-inch painting is called La Mauvaise Compagnie, Bad Company, and it literally paints a cautionary tale of the perils of a good time at a brothel. All around the scene is evidence of vice and debauchery, and alcohol, gambling cards, and tobacco strewn around, along with a broken pipe at the robbed man's feet and a glass that has snapped its stem and spilled alcohol on the floor. A man is smoking in the background while a musician plays a viola. Both are watching the scene unfold in the foreground, and they're both unconcerned. The musician even laughs openly. They are watching a man passed out on the lap of a prostitute, while another prostitute relieves him of his pocket watch. That woman unabashedly offers it up to a nun, who, already laden with questionably procured valuables, just as unabashedly moves to accept the watch. It is unclear if the nun is legitimate or if she's actually a male accomplice dressed as a nun, since pickpocketing prostitutes often worked with a male partner. It's a very funny scene either way, and it is typical of Steen's humorous moralizing through paint. It is also an example of what set Baroque apart from the Renaissance. This is about capturing a moment in time, like a modern snapshot. It doesn't look or feel posed, but instead appears candid and very real, which is another hallmark of the Baroque period. The subjects are rendered as very human, and there is none of the idealized form of the Renaissance. These are regular people with regular looks. Soft light was also a characteristic of Baroque painting, and its effects are apparent, even as it's subtle. There's a direct light source, and it throws highlights, lowlights, and shadows around the scene very gracefully and realistically, from the shadows cast beneath people's feet and chairs, to the lowlights and shadows in the folds of the fabrics, and to the highlights and shadows falling on the bare skin of the prostitutes' shoulders, cleavage, and faces. It's all very gently wrought in a scandalous setting. Baroque artwork tends to lose the stability of composition compared to Renaissance art, and that's evidenced here with the diagonals created by the unconscious man, the thief, and the two men in the back. Even the sword in the nun's hand is a diagonal, and it makes the painting look less composed, which is also what makes it look and feel like a very real moment in time. Like the viewer is witnessing the scene because he or she is in that brothel, not just looking at a painting. This is another component of the Baroque, and it is underscored by the sitting woman gazing out from the canvas, giving a very realistic illusion of eye contact with the viewer. The temperament of the entire style made this type of work very much in demand, and brothel scenes were not uncommon subjects, which is very interesting when remembering this painting and others like it were created at a time when prostitution and adultery were criminal acts, and sex outside of marriage was considered whoredom. Pietro Paolini was a Baroque painter from Tuscany who studied in Rome under a Caravaggius. Under the tutelage of that devotee, of course, Paolini was himself heavily influenced by Caravaggio, which is evident in this painting, The Card Sharps. It measures a little over 3 feet by 4 feet, and it was very clearly inspired by Caravaggio's canvas of the same name. In Paolini's version, we see a very well-heeled young man facing off in a game of cards with a contrasting opponent. There is a spectator behind the wealthy boy who appears very interested in the gameplay, his eyes glued to the posh boy's cards. But he is actually the accomplice of the rougher-looking player, signaling him behind the mark's back. Many of the formal elements of the Baroque are evident here, the way the light plays around the subject and objects. It is a bright light, but gentle at the same time, as if sunlight is peeking through a window, or a lantern is turned up nearby to light the cards, but none of it is strong enough to penetrate the background shadows. And, like Caravaggio, the darkness only seems to exist to push the scene outward to the viewer. And it's just as well, because whatever may be happening in the background is not nearly as interesting as what we're seeing in the foreground. The realism is well executed in a candid moment notable of the Baroque. The boy being swindled seems unaware of the accomplice leaning out of the shadows. His own eyes are locked intently on his opponent's face, and he seems to have an almost sly look in his eye, as if he's sure he'll win, especially since the other boy's face looks like he's uncertain about his hand. Meanwhile, the viewer sees exactly the hustle that's unfolding here, with a hidden 7 of diamonds under the haphazardly situated chessboard. And again, as is customary in Baroque art, the line between scene and viewer is obscured, even more so with all those diagonals. The overturned dice cup is on a bias, and it in turn props up the corner of the chessboard, which is also one big diagonal. Several if considering the lines creating the squares on the board. Further, the card players' arms are at angles, and their seated positions cause their torsos to arc as they consider their cards and each other. And the cheat's partner is set diagonally as well, along with his 3 extended fingers. It all pushes their movements into the viewer's space. Imagining moments when this piece might have been illuminated by candlelight on the wall of a home makes it even easier for the viewer to feel as though he has stumbled upon a roguish scene, and his candlelight is the actual light source, and this isn't just a painting. A lot of the subject matter of the Baroque artists were exactly this kind of captured moment, where Paolini liked to fiddle with representations of the criminal subculture, and, like Jan Steen, can be viewed as a cautionary tale against gambling, greed, and hubris. Toward the end of Louis XIV's reign, the French aristocracy shifted their attention from Versailles and the monarchy back to Paris, and it is that shift which came to define the Rococo period in Western art. The very wealthy and powerful aristocratic class could choose any number of diversions to occupy themselves, but many endeavored to undertake idleness, pleasure, and romantic machinations as callings. The Age of Enlightenment was dawning, and pioneers of the movement hated Rococo and advocated a style change to something more noble than the spoilt and debauched behavior glamorized and normalized in Rococo. But the style would flourish until the French Revolution in 1789. Originated by Antoine Watteau, Rococo was noteworthy for scenes of fêtes galantes, small gatherings of mixed company in a park or garden for the purpose of flirtation and romance. And this is typical of other artists' work in this period, including that of Jean-Honoré Fragonard. An excellent example of this is his work, The Musical Contest. Standing around 2 feet by 2.5 feet shows a woman and 2 men finely dressed and retiring in a garden, clearly courting her and competing against each other in a contest of musical skill. The light is a remnant of the Baroque style, soft, throwing gentle shadows around the garden and highlighting her chest and the luxurious folds of her peach dress, creating a very sensual spotlight for her. The pastels and golds are hallmarks of Rococo as well as themes of love and playfulness. She stands leaning into the suitor holding a flute, who kneels before her and grasps her about her waist. Her opposite arm is outstretched toward the other suitor, who holds a musette. Reclining at her feet, he looks up at her longingly as she looks about to reward him with a flower crown, but she doesn't seem to be looking at him. Instead, she has a far-off look on her face, like she's either still weighing her decision, or perhaps she is less interested in actually choosing one and is enjoying tormenting them. Behind the threesome is a fountain with sculptures of cherubs. The garden is wild, but the pumpkin and apples in the foreground, as well as the orange and gold leaves, indicate that it is autumn, which is interesting because so many other scenes like this are set in spring or summer, showcasing youth and vitality. But autumn has a decidedly different symbolism of maturity and transition. Could this reflect that the woman's age is a key to her staging this contest, that it's time to choose a partner for fear of winding up a spinster? Whatever the answer, this and other Rococo paintings celebrate entitlement, opulence, and self-indulgence, glorifying everything that would usher in the French Revolution.